I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to our wonderful APA style team to kick us off. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar, Process Over Product, Setting Students Up for Success in Writing APA-Style Papers. If you've been to any of our webinars over the past year or couple of years, you may have heard us recommend teaching APA style incrementally instead of, having a 30-minute or 1-hour session where you try and put the entire publication manual and everything students ever need to know about writing in one lesson. And we're going to take that a little bit further today. In our research and conversations with students and educators, we found that scaffolding, the incremental steps of conducting research and creating a research paper, leads to better outcomes for students and ultimately better science. This is especially true as AI tools become more technologically advanced and more accessible. Focusing on the full research and writing process can be a helpful way to encourage your students to meet their learning objectives and hone their critical thinking skills. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. My name is Samantha Denany, and I'm here with my colleagues Chelsea Lee and Timothy McAdoo. We're members of the APA Style Team, which is the team responsible for creating, updating, teaching, and promoting APA Style guidelines, as well as the publication manual, concise guide, APA Style website, and more. So, as I mentioned, today we're going to talk about scaffolding the writing process to encourage critical thinking about science. So, we'll talk about selecting sources, creating annotated bibliographies, incorporating sources that cite other sources, framing discussions on inclusive language, developing awareness of APA-style journal article reporting standards, and what to do if you have questions or get stuck. As Andrea mentioned in the beginning, we should have time for questions at the end, so use the Q&A function for any questions that you have that you want to make sure we see. And feel free to interact with your fellow attendees in the chat. We just can't guarantee we're going to see it. So I'm going to send it over to Chelsea, who will start off by talking about selecting and evaluating sources.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Samantha. So to begin here, I feel like the idea with academic writing, particularly in science-based disciplines like psychology, is that often you're going to have students be responding to a text, to some kind of information. And selecting what those sources might be can be a big lift for students to get them to find something that's appropriate, that will be good science for them to react to and engage with. So during this section of the presentation, I'm going to talk about that process. Let's go to the next slide. So our first issue is, where are you going to recommend that students look for sources? And I think it's vital to emphasize to use library resources. Libraries at the specific school are going to know what resources students have access to as a result of being enrolled at that school. And often library websites have research guides organized by subjects, listing the academic research databases that are available to the students at that school. And typically those academic research databases are going to be containing peer-reviewed sources, trustworthy information that's been vetted by people. And I think an important part of this is that you're thinking about developing the ties between the library and the department that you're speaking in. I know at some schools, like, they'll have the librarian come give a talk to the class or but sometimes those presentations maybe have gotten cut due to budgetary concerns. And so introducing reliance and exploration of library resources is really important. On screen, these are some examples of library resources that are common in the United States, but we have people attending from all around the world, so obviously the resources you have access to might be different. Let's go to the next slide. So this is a handout that can help students understand what's in a source that they find. So say they go to a library research and they perform a search and they find something, and you're going to look at it and be like, how are you going to make sense of this? Because typically science as published in journals is pretty high level, like the reading level is pretty high, and it can be challenging for somebody who's never read it before to figure out what to do. And so this resource is available on the APA Style website. It's called the Anatomy of a Journal Article handout, and we're going to put a link in the chat for you to get to it as well. But the purpose of this handout is to say what's where in an article. If you look in the abstract, what are you going to find? You'll find a summary of the article. Or if you're looking to figure out what's the point of this, like what's the takeaways, you might direct the students to the discussion section of the article. And the goal here is to teach students to be strategic readers, to not expect that they're just going to sit down with like a 20-page tiny print article and read it from start to finish and say, yes, I understand, but rather going to different sections, knowing what those sections are and knowing what they might expect to find in those sections can help them become more efficient and effective readers. And as Samantha mentions, this helps integrate APA style into your curriculum because the ways that articles are organized is part of APA style. So that strengthens that. Next slide. Great. So once you have a source, you got to look at it and be like, I've kind of got an idea of what it says, but is this a good source for the task at hand is the question. So depending on your assignment, it's going to be different, but the goal of evaluating whether what they've selected is useful or not, I think can be broken down into these sort of 5 qualities here, which first looking at having students evaluate whether the work is relevant to the topic that they're researching about, because sometimes it seems like it'll be relevant, but it's not. Evaluating whether the source has been written by experts, and how can you tell? Knowing whether the source has been published in an academic journal or a book, which has then been peer reviewed, is key. And then looking at when was this published? Is this science current? Making sure that it's not outdated. And I feel like it could be a nice activity to maybe pick one example source and to go through it together as a class and to look at each of those qualities. Because like after you've been doing teaching or researching for a long time, you get a feel for, the names of universities and where people might work and what journals are good for information in a certain topic area. But when you're a beginner, you don't know any of that stuff. So walking them through how to look into these things, like you can Google the name of the people who wrote and see where they work, could be key. And I want to note as well that regarding the age of sources, that APA does not have rules regarding how old a source is or isn't allowed to be. However, sometimes instructors have rules that they want research to be within, say, the last 5 years, the last 10 years. It's going to depend on the timeline. So, but for that, I want to emphasize that that's coming from the instructor or like the department who's setting parameters for an assignment, not from APA. Let's go to the next slide. So I want to point out that the list of 5 things that I just spoke about evaluating sources correspond to the 4 elements of a reference in APA style. The experts are your authors. The currency is, you can look at the date to figure out that. The relevance to the topic, you can tell some from the title if it's going to be relevant. And then the source, those qualities are where it's published and whether it's been peer reviewed. And like if you want to show your students this slide from this presentation to show the correspondence, like that's great. We're making these resources to help you. And it's tying things together and showing that APA style is part of the curriculum. Next slide. So say you picked one. Say you picked a source. Now what are you going to do? Important to emphasize for students what to look for regarding selecting a source. First, you have to read it. even if you get AI to help you see what it says, and I know we've gotten some questions ahead of time about AI, lots of people want to know what they're supposed to do. You have to read it yourself. Other qualities of sources to look for, or to encourage students to look for, are to encourage them to look for primary or original research, or to look for research that analyzes other existing research. So that would be something like a literature review or a meta-analysis. And so on screen are some keywords that you could give to students to say, hey, look for these words in the paper to tell if this is reporting original research, versus sometimes students end up with like magazine articles or like newspaper articles about research versus the research itself. So like looking for these terms is going to help them distinguish between reporting about the research and actual research. Let's go to the next slide. So an activity also free, available on the APA style website, that is great for this source selection and evaluation process is called the APA style research article activity. What it does is helps you find an article, cite it, and then analyze it, going through each section of it to say like, what did the researchers do? What method did they follow? What did they find? What's the importance of what they found? And it's taking you through it step by step. And that's the whole theme of this webinar, is going step by step, focusing on the process. And the result of this activity, and there's more pages that are just shown here, the result of it is going to be like a 1 or 2 paragraph summary that students could then use in a research paper or in an annotated bibliography paper, which we had mentioned is going to be in a later section of this presentation. So this, they're going to drop the link in the chat to this activity, is a great one to use with your students. Do next slide. Question on everyone's mind is probably, should you use AI to find sources? And before I talk about whether you should, I want to preface here that like APA isn't saying that you should or isn't saying that you shouldn't. What we're doing is we want to explore, like, if you did, what happens? If students do this, what are they going to find? And like, we're all learning about these tools, and there's some examples on screen, but there's lots of examples of different AIs. But APA is not governing when or how researchers and students are using these different tools. We have policies about, if you do use them, how to cite them and what's appropriate use in the research and publication context. And there's 2 links about those resources that we're going to put in the chat, which is about our blog post on citing ChatGPT and our APA journals policy regarding the use of generative AI. But an important to, when you're like getting your mindset around using AI, is that it's all the AIs are different from each other, and the field's evolving very quickly. So just because we're saying it this week doesn't mean that it's going to stay true in the future. So with that, let's proceed. So I tried it. I tried asking AI for sources for a paper that I was going to write. So I asked the new ChatGPT, the 01 mini model that just came out last week. I asked it for 5 peer-reviewed sources on the effects of parental divorce on child development from the last 5 years. And oh my goodness, it looked great. I was like, this is exactly what I'm looking for. You can see like it summarized them for me, and I asked them for APA style references, and it gave them, and they were formatted right. And I was like, well, I'm sold. And then we'll go to the next slide and see what happened. There were big problems. So here were some of the problems that happened to me in this one example case. I had one that's, the first reference is right until you get to the DOI, which is the link to the article. And the DOI goes to this article about depression. Totally wrong. 3 of the sources are real, but they're way outside the time frame of 5 years. Like one of them is from 1990. And then another source seemed to be pieces of other sources that the AI just put together. like there was an article with this title, association being between parental divorce and mental health outcomes in Lebanese adolescents. That article existed, but it was written by different people than the AI indicated to me. So the point was that I had to be very diligent to check the results that it gave me because it looked good, but it was not a trustworthy process happening here. So the point here is to make sure that you're verifying the information. And I feel like it could be even useful to, go through this activity with your students and to look more deeply into it. Because if you have knowledge, expertise in the domains that you're asking about, you can see where the problems are more than you could if you were a beginner. So with that, we're going to turn the next section of the presentation over to my colleague Tim, who's going to talk about creating annotated bibliographies as sort of a next step after you've identified sources and created little summaries of them.
Make sure to unmute myself. So thanks, Chelsea. Yeah, I'm going to turn to a discussion about annotated bibliographies, but we do have more about AI both in this section and then later in the presentation. So as you likely know, next slide, please, Samantha. As you likely know, instructors often assign annotated bibliographies as a way to help students break the writing process down into smaller components, to practice their reading and analyzing a research paper, and then to practice writing APA-style references and generally understanding one article at a time. And so with an annotated bibliography, the student can focus on one study at a time and understand the researcher's initial ideas and the results they got. And then after having created short summaries for the entry of each study in the annotated bibliography, the student should be able to compare and contrast those ideas for the, let's say, 5 studies and the results and the ideas in those studies. So this is an introductory way to approach writing a literature review, where they would do the same thing, just not so segmented. And so annotated bibliographies are sometimes assigned as an incremental step in the writing process with the goal of becoming a research paper, or they're sometimes assigned as something to include at the end of a paper, just like you would a regular reference list. So we have a new sample annotated bibliography to share today. This is brand new on our website. It was written by someone who interned with us. She was a high school student, now off to college, and it includes 5 sources with single paragraph annotations that demonstrate how to analyze and discuss those works. So we hope that this example helps students just learning just learning this skill. And this is in addition to the annotated bibliography example that's in the publication manual in section 9.51, which includes formatting guidelines as well. So thinking about annotated bibliographies and AI, question is, should students use AI to, couldn't they just say, write my annotated bibliography? It seems like AI is good at tasks where they summarize. And second, if a student does that, what do they lose in the process, not having maybe read the article? So we used a platform called Perplexity AI to analyze a paper and asked it to write an annotation. And you can see here, in comparing what we wrote and then what the AI wrote, we felt that the human written annotation contained more detail and a clear analysis. And so this is a suggestion for an activity for students. You might ask students to replicate this process by reading a research paper and then writing their own annotation and then comparing what the AI produced. And they might learn both from what the AI did well and then what it didn't do well. A second assignment you could do after that would be asking students to provide maybe with a second paper, but do the same process, read a paper, write an annotation, and then provide that to the AI and ask the AI to suggest what might be missing, especially if that AI can compare against the original article itself. So in ways like this, students can they can learn what makes a good analysis of research and what makes a good annotated bibliography, and then also explore the benefits and the drawbacks of using AI or AI tools. Next slide, please. So with that, I'll be moving away from AI just for a bit. To talk about citations. So students also need to develop skills around artfully citing other works in ways that inform their readers and illustrate the most important aspects of the works that they are trying to cite. So we often address questions about how to format citations, where does the punctuation go, that kind of thing. But in the next few slides, we want to focus on how to cite sources in the most clear and informative ways to really highlight why these sources are important that you're citing. So with that, the first slide is determining which sources to cite. So anything in your paper that's not cited, the reader understands to be your own thought or your own statement of fact. And so it's important to cite anything that you are quoting or paraphrasing, and to always be clear where that line is between what you're presenting as established research and what is your interpretation of that research, or what is your own new ideas. So, but that said, it doesn't mean citing after every sentence. So that would be over citing. So for a long paragraph, you can cite the work at the beginning of the paragraph, and then all the sentences that follow in that paragraph can be uncited as long as the context is clear in your writing that this is the same work you're talking about, the work that you've cited. So as noted on this slide, you can see those guidelines about the appropriate level of citation in Chapter 8 of the publication manual. And we also have examples on our website. Just search for the word paraphrasing. We can put that link in the chat as well. And we have a paraphrasing and citation activities handout that you can provide to students that really lets them work through exercises about how to paraphrase work and how to cite it. And although you do always want to cite your sources accurately and distinguish between the ideas that you're summarizing and your own unique, ideas, you don't have to go the extra layer to always to also cite the works that your sources cited. So otherwise, you have what feels like an infinite regression, where you just like, where does it end? Because everyone has cited something down the line. So you can see in the left column here, we have that Harmon et al. 2022 wrote about how chronic exposure to poorly managed interparental conflict affects children's psychological development. And Harmon et al. Supported their statement of fact that this chronic exposure is a known risk by citing quite a large number of other studies. Now, let's say you're doing research on childhood psychological development, and in your literature review, this is just one of many things that you want to touch on. You want to acknowledge that this is a fact and a field of study. You can do what we've done here in the right-hand column. So you paraphrase Harmon et al.'s assertion, and you can simply cite that Harmon et al. 2022 without also citing all those works that they cited. So you're really just relying on Harmon et al.'s understanding and summation of those works, and you're citing Harmon et al. Because that's what you actually read. And then the next reader, someone who's reading your paper, and if they're interested in that, they might go to your reference lists, look up the Harmon et al. Paper, and if they do, they'll see that supporting evidence. And if interested, they will go from there and read those. Which yeah, next slide here. So that's something you might do too. So when you're reading a work and you find that the authors have made a statement or they provided data that's particularly pertinent to your own research, and they've cited a work to support it, and you might just want to go look at that cited work and read it in context, make sure you understand it, make sure you agree, that it's still supporting the thing that you are trying to say. And you might find that, like in this example, you're focused on, and that's writing something different, a little bit different than what the first paper was, but it's still, that first paper was a good jumping off point. It led you to a good source for what you are writing about. So in this example, Harmon et al. 2022 described O'Hara et al.'s 2021 research. And if it's relevant to your work, you'd read O'Hara et al.'s 2021 paper, and then you could just cite that paper. And you don't need to mention that you got there by means of the Harmon et al. Paper. It's all part of the research experience that you're going to be reading a lot more than maybe you actually end up citing as important in your work. And then it's also possible to use an as cited in citation. So this is when a source you're reading cites something else that you would find useful to paraphrase or quote. That could be a good point or a direct quote or some bit of data that the source you're reading states but attributes to another source. But in this case, that source, you can't find it. It might be that the original work is out of print, or it's in another language and you can't really verify, you can't read it for yourself, or it's rare, obscure, or difficult to obtain, meaning maybe it's in a museum or in an archival library that you'd have to go to and you aren't able to. So in that case, your citation can indicate that you're relying on that same bit of information, but you're trusting the source that you actually read to have presented it correctly. So you write your sentence as usual with a citation at the end. And in this case, that's the Schneider 1958. And then you add this little extra note that says, as cited in Parker et al. 2002. That's the article that you saw that in. So then your reference list includes just a reference to that source, the one you actually read, which is Parker et al. 2022. And you can do that. It should be a rare occurrence. You don't really want to over rely on that or do it when the original work is just kind of inconvenient to find, like your library doesn't have it, but you could buy it, or you could get it from interlibrary loan if you had more time. You know, it's really better to use this when you need to. So in cases like this where it's just completely unavailable to you, but the you trust what the source is that you read to have accurately represented it, and it makes a point that is important to your paper that you still would like to include. And then sorry, and finally, you also have the option of a see also citation. So this is a different circumstance. Here you have a statement that you want to back up with a large number of studies, but one of them in particular makes the strongest argument or most closely supports the point you're making. So in that case, in this case, it's Daphne, Miram, and Arzi. And what you can do is cite that one first and then add this little see also note in the format shown here to cite all of the other studies. So they're still important, but you really want to highlight this one in particular. And this lets you follow the usual APA style guideline for alphabetizing citations when they all appear together in a parentheses, but also lets you prioritize the one work that you really want people to focus on. And this addresses the concern about alphabetization bias. If you feel that this one important work will be sort of lost in the shuffle just because of where it would appear in a list if alphabetized. And with that, I forget, is this you or Chelsea or Samantha?
It's me. Wonderful. Thank you, Tim. Okay, so this next section of the presentation is going to be about how to frame discussions of inclusive language when you are teaching students how to write papers in APA style. So let's begin sort of with a zoomed out view of like, what's the purpose of talking about inclusive language in the context of APA style in the first place? And the goal here is to encourage students to think about the words that they choose to describe other people and the world, and to specifically encourage them to choose words that treat people with dignity and respect. Inclusive language is language choices that intentionally create space for everyone, that allow people to recognize themselves. And the ultimate goal of it is better communication. Because if you use words that people say, oh, yeah, that's me, then they're going to be more likely to listen to what you have to say. Whereas if you choose words that are alienating, or they're like, no, that's not me, then they're going to tune you out and not be paying attention. And so I think looking at it from a very practical standpoint can be a great way to get buy-in from students. Let's go to the next slide. So I lost one. There it is. This is a handout that we have available on the APA Style website. This is our brief guide to bias-free and inclusive language. It's a free handout that summarizes a lot of the information that I'm going to be describing to you next. So we'll drop the link for this in the chat, but so I want you to have that as well, that like we've already done some of the work of putting it on paper for you to share it with your students. But in addition, I'm going to speak to some of the information that's on this page in the slides that come. So let's go to the next one. Great. So why should you listen to us? So APA Style, we're here from the American Psychological Association, and APA has been providing science-backed guidance on inclusive language for more than 45 years. It's evolved over a long time to include lots of different topic areas, but the premise of what's happening is that psychological science that's being conducted with real people is generates research articles where researchers say, this is what we found, this is how people want to be called. That gets published. And then on top of that, we can say, here are some general principles for how to communicate inclusively. And then on top of those general principles, here's some specific recommendations about different topics of language that you can use. And over time, society keeps changing, language changes, and people disagree. People aren't a monolith. And so like even with that all in mind, the goal is to be as inclusive as possible and respecting the way in which the recommendations we're making are ultimately coming from the people themselves. Let's go to the next slide. Great. So on the previous one, I talked about 2 general principles for inclusive language, and these are what they are. The 2 principles are, first, to describe people at the right level of specificity. So if you're going to be picking a general term, a very general term would be person or individual or human, a word like that. You can get more specific, usually by adding qualifiers that indicate a person's age or gender are 2 really common ones. So for example, you might say an adult rather than a person, or an adolescent or a child. And you can get more specific by adding other terms related to gender, and a whole mix of qualities. So what's on the screen is just examples. The second principle for avoiding bias is to be sensitive to labels by calling people what they want to be called. Ways to do that are to use person-first language and identity-first language. Those 2 kinds of languages, examples of that would be like person with Down syndrome is a person-first language. You have the word person with and then the with. Or identity-first language would be something like deaf person or blind person, where you have the adjective that comes before the noun. Those 2 language choices are generally considered inclusive and good ways to refer to people. Different people in different communities will have preferences over which one that they prefer, and you should abide by those preferences when you get to that level of specificity. However, generally you want to avoid stigmatizing nouning language, like saying the schizophrenics or the mentally retarded. Those are, it's considered like offensive and kind of, I don't know, totalizing, like the person's only the condition, they're not a person anymore. So these two principles are the things to hold in your mind: amount of specificity and call people what they want to be called. So APA has a wealth of resources about different topics for inclusive language, including age, body size and weight, disability, gender, participation in research, pregnancy, neurodiversity, race and ethnicity, sexual orientation, and socioeconomic status. The ones with asterisks, which are body size and weight, pregnancy, and neurodiversity, are new topics for APA that are part of our Inclusive Language Guide, second edition, that was published in 2023. So if you haven't tuned into APA's resources recently, please definitely check those out. But so depending on what topic area your students are writing their papers in, it could be beneficial to recommend that they go read the targeted resources about that topic area so that they can learn more about language choices. Let's go to the next slide. So these are the two of the main ways to get APA's inclusive language information. There's a lot of it. You can find it in the bias-free language chapter of the publication manual, as well as in our concise guide, and you can find it on the APA Style website. And additionally, you can check out our new Inclusive Language Guide, second edition, that came out last fall, and we'll be putting links to those resources in the chat. All of this is available free on the internet, in addition to the chapter that's in our publication manual and concise guide. So I didn't want to leave you with no specific recommendations, so I picked out a few that I still see people maybe using less inclusive terms and that they could be improved. So these are some examples of terms that are discussed in our resources, and you would see more about what the why behind the terms are in the resources. But some examples are like, instead of saying the elderly to refer to older adults, say older adults. And the goal there is that, like, you don't want this idea that of like infirmness of somebody who's older that you would get with the word elderly. Likewise, instead of terms like special needs or handy-capable, which are euphemistic and kind of patronizing, use the word disabled. That's the word that disabled people want you to use, is disabled. So use that. Likewise, when you're talking about like a generic or example person, don't use pronoun combinations like he or she or he, or like the ones with the S in parentheses. Just use they. Use the singular they. So like if you're making an announcement and you say somebody left their keys in the classroom, like that construction has been used for centuries. And since the 7th edition, it's something that's been an official part of APA style. And we really want to encourage you all to embrace that and to embrace that for your students. And then a last one to take with you today is when you're talking about race and ethnicity, instead of Caucasian, say white. The term Caucasian has a racist origin story. It's not great. And it's clearer to just say white and to capitalize it to match the way that other racial and ethnic labels are capitalized. Next slide. So last thoughts here on inclusive language. Can AI choose inclusive language? Not really. The bias that's in language is part of the AI training data. AI is predicting what word comes next, not what word is best. And the most inclusive language that was maybe in the past is not necessarily what's the most inclusive for today. And so like, here's 2 examples. I asked Gemini and ChatGPT to tell me about handy-capable kids. And I got one that tells me handy-capable is outdated and offensive, and the other one that tells me it's positive and empowering. And the only way you would really be able to know the difference is if you're looking at resources that are written by humans. like the ones that come from APA are examples, like those are coming based on science. And so that's the more of a cautionary tale about AI. You're muted, Samantha.
Thank you.
No
So
worries.
I'm going to talk about developing awareness of APA-style journal article reporting standards, which we often refer to as JARS colloquially. And as educators, you might be familiar with journal article reporting standards, maybe from your own research, but they may seem complex, but they can also be really helpful for students of all levels, because they provide clear instructions for what should be communicated in research. So you might be familiar with how APA-style JARS is going to provide specific standards for reporting results in quantitative, qualitative, and mixed methods research. It also follows the same structure as a journal article. So the method, it'll tell you what to include in the methods section, the results section, etc. And it's also, especially if you're working with some beginner students, it's a really great thing to pair with our journal article, anatomy of a journal article handout that we showed in the beginning. We also recently came out with new standards for reporting race, ethnicity, and culture, which is called JARS Rec, and that applies to all kinds of research. So JARS tables are going to follow the structure of journal articles. And a great first step for students might be to look at JARS for doing like an introduction or looking at the abstract of a paper and really understanding what needs to be included in those parts of a paper. So JARS can be helpful at all levels. You might think about a published researcher using JARS, but really students find that it can help them better organize and present their work. And instructors find that JARS can help transform and promote research thinking. So it can be a really good idea to introduce your students to our journal article reporting standards. The purpose of the journal article reporting standards are to facilitate communication of science, improve clarity and completeness of research reports, facilitate replication and meta-analysis, enhance credibility of research, and help readers better understand and evaluate studies. So you can find our journal article reporting standards on our website, as well as chapter 3 of the publication manual. So we will share a link to our journal article reporting standards page. We also would recommend taking a look at the new JARS for race, ethnicity, and culture, which we can share in the chat as well. We also have resources for instructors and students, and a recent blog post that talked about introducing APA-style JARS to high school students. So even if you're not working with high school students, it is a really great way to show how to communicate what JARS is, how it can be used, and some good resources for students who are kind of starting out and might not be ready to take, a JARS table and use it to help with their research. I even talked to a research methods professor who told me that she uses our journal article reporting standard as almost like a checklist for what should be included in each part of a paper. So it's a really great, they're really great standards to include and to think about in your curriculum. So I'm going to turn it over to Tim, who's going to talk about what to do if you have questions or get stuck.
Okay, thank you, Samantha. So our last section here is about what to do if you have questions or get stuck. And I'm going to run through a few of the common topics where people have the most questions, and then briefly outline the sections, mostly of the manual, but also of the website where you can turn. So first, reference questions. One kind of secret is that while people tend to skip right to chapter 10 to see the reference examples, Chapter 9 actually has all of the guidelines that spell out what determines why those examples are the way they are. So chapter 9 is organized by the 4 elements of a reference: the author, the date, the title, and the source. And then the answers throughout that chapter 9, one section at a time, all the really common questions that people run into as they put their references together, and the things that then are illustrated in chapter 10. And so then chapter 10 itself is a great resource for matching. If you have a source and you're trying to just see a similar example, obviously that's a good way to create your reference. And there are examples in chapter 10 about citing websites and articles and books and social media and dissertations and dictionaries and so much more. So each section of chapter 10 starts with a template for the kinds of details that belong in a reference for that type of work. And then after that template, specific examples. And then if you find that the thing that you're creating a reference for is missing some of those details, you can always consult table 9.1 in chapter 9 to help figure out how to adjust the reference to account for missing information. And then, so for in-text citations, the general format for in-text citations is fairly straightforward because it always matches the reference. So you're in your text and you're talking about something and you cite it, you're going to include the author and the date. And then that matches the reference, which has all the additional information. However, as you run into formatting questions for how to include citations with paraphrases and direct quotations, you have questions, you can see those in the sections on the slide here from chapter 8. And then really, we get a lot of questions about how to spell things, just how to spell certain words that have options, or how to hyphenate, how to capitalize. And so our process is this. We first look at the APA Dictionary of Psychology for psychological terms. And then if a word is not in there, we turn to the Merriam-Webster's online dictionary. And our general spelling principles are in section 6.11, and hyphenation principles are in 6.12 of the publication manual. Finally, everything you need to know about paper formatting, from title page, margins and fonts and everything, is in chapter 2 of the manual. This slide shows just a few of the sections, but chapter 2 itself walks through each element of a paper and provides guidelines. And then in addition, in chapter 2, you can find 2 sample papers, one for the professional paper format and one for a student paper. And you can find those 2, as well as many other sample papers, on our instructional aids page, which includes qualitative and quantitative and a lot of lit reviews and other types of papers, as well as our brand new annotated bibliography. And I think that gives us time for questions.
Yes, it does. So we're going to answer questions. So make sure you have your questions in the Q&A. I did want to just do a quick plug for our next webinar, which is going to be for nursing instructors. So if you work with nursing instructors, if you are a nursing instructor, we're actually going to be partnering with a nurse educator, and we're going to talk about supporting nursing students and evidence-based practice through APA style writing skills. And we're going to give some really practical tips along with our nurse educator friend, who's going to come in and give some great information as well. So keep a lookout for emails about that webinar, but we're really excited for it. But let's focus on some questions. So one person asked, how can we help students use AI for their benefit rather than using it to write their papers for them? Chelsea or Tim, do you have any ideas there?
I feel like you got to be more specific about what the benefit is going to be. What do they need? So for example, I know a lot of people use tools like Grammarly to help students with grammar, which includes AI tools. And like there's AI tools that are embedded in versions of like Microsoft Word now. And so like that would be a way of using AI to help with sentence structure. I think AI can be really helpful in like the brainstorming phase to say like, well, here are my thoughts so far. What haven't I thought of? It can be helpful with that. But I really, and additionally, I think taking a very a critical eye toward the things that it produces and evaluating them and verifying them and not just saying like, oh, it said this is the answer and that's the answer. Like remembering that it's just predicting what word comes next, not necessarily, it's not thinking like a person thinks. What do you think, Tim?
Hmm. No, I agree with all that. I mean, that's my favorite suggestion is to ask people to write what they would have written anyway, and then use it as an editor, as a follow, just like you might hand it to someone and say, read this for me, please, and tell me what I'm missing. I mean, you can do that with AI and either use what it suggests or don't, but you know, it's a helpful second read almost.
I think it's useful to be really intentional about what the learning objectives are that you want your students to accomplish. Like there have been a lot of people who have suggested using AI to paraphrase. Well, I think we kind of believe that paraphrasing is a really important skill for students to learn. So we wouldn't want them to necessarily bypass that. Um, some people have mentioned things like, syntax checking and like just making sure, their wording sounds good. And really, I think it comes down to the instructor and what you're trying to accomplish with your students and kind of, my favorite analogy that the Department of Education, their like ed tech committee came up with is to think of AI like an electric bike where it's going to help you get up a hill, but you're still in full control. You're still pedaling. It's just going to help you get up that hill as opposed to something that is going to kind of do things on its own. So we need students to remain in control and make sure that they're doing their critical thinking, they're learning and not just passing that off to AI. Jay asks, in the sample annotated bio, it includes a narrative citations. Is it necessary since it's understood to mean that the paragraph is about the above source?
There's lots of ways you could write the annotations. I think including the narrative citation is helpful if the annotated bibliography is a step on the writing process. Like maybe the annotated bibliography is like a midpoint assignment, and then later the students are going to use those annotations to like combine them to be part of a research paper. But there's lots of ways that you could write the annotation. So just because it's written one way in an example doesn't mean that there aren't other ways to do it. The goal is primarily to show that the source is being discussed for the space of a paragraph.
Another question that I think we might have included the answer in an earlier version of the presentation. Are there AI research tools that are maybe more accurate? And this person is thinking of elicit or consensus.
Probably. I hope there's ones that are doing a good job. And I'm sure that in the future, people are working on these tools and helping refining them. But the key to knowing whether the AI is doing a good job is to have expertise in the area that you're asking it about. So if like you're inquiring about something that you don't know very much about, it's much harder to tell whether the AI is giving you useful, trustworthy information. And so like if you're going to recommend specific ones to your students, like look into it with them or like look into it yourself and let us know what you find too. Feel free to share with us. There's so many out there, like we can't possibly have seen them all.
Yeah, I would add only that like there's of course, the obvious, like it will create references that are bogus or that are combining, that are just no good. But it will also sometimes give you accurate references. So if you, as long as you do your work and click on that DOI and see that it's actually the thing, I mean, it can potentially get you to something good, but is that faster than if you had just looked in your database? I don't know. Probably not at this point, but I agree with Chelsea. It's probably only getting better.
Following along with a question about technology, what are your opinions on citation software such as Zotero? Do you find they help students or present difficulties?
Yes.
Both.
I mean, they're great. It takes out some of the data entry work. That's great, but it's almost a similar answer. Just then you need to check behind and see that you're happy with the quality of it. And like Chelsea said, you have to sort of know it well in a little bit to know what you're looking at to see if it's wrong. So it's still worth learning it to start with.
Yeah, I like to think of it kind of like a calculator. Like you have to learn math, you have to learn the skills before you're given a calculator. So if you want to ensure that your citations are going to be formatted correctly, knowing author, date, title, source is super important to be able to spot any places where there might be mistakes or things like that, and to be able to use it really effectively. Should the reference citation for a website include a retrieval statement, or should that be omitted?
So I assume maybe the person means the statement like retrieved from, and that is not included in like a typical website citation anymore. What you want to do if you're making a reference for a website, like a reference for anything else, it's got to have author, date, title, source. And for a website, the source is going to be the URL of the website. And there are some circumstances under which you might use the words retrieved from if you're going to be including a date, but most of the time you don't need it. But I will put a link in the chat to our reference examples page about websites, and that's going to have a wealth of examples for you to follow.
So it looks like we're running out of time. So one last question is, if a figure does not need to take the entire width of the page, should it be centered or left aligned?
It doesn't really matter. You can do it how it looks nice. And if it's not taking up the whole width of the page, I would look at how big the elements are in the figure itself. Sometimes the way it gets spit out originally, or like everything, all the labeling will be really tiny. So like maybe you could make it bigger so that it's more legible. But ultimately, you can leave it left aligned. Like I feel like that's the way, because most things in APA style papers are left aligned. But that's one of those things that it doesn't. If you're consistent, as long as you're consistent.
So we are at about time. We did have a couple of questions about where to find resources and just questions that we don't have time to answer. So here are our resources. We've got publication manual, the concise guide. You can find us on social media. You can email us at styleexpert@apa.org. So if you have, specific questions about a paper, obviously, if you we can't format all your references for you, but we can answer some tricky questions. So thank you so much for joining us. It was great to see the chat so active and the Q&A so active. And definitely let us know any questions or comments or anything like that in our email or social media channels.
Thank you everyone for joining us today. We'll see you at the next one. Have a great day.